Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon-Muñiz.
Welcome back to another fabulous episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. Today, we're talking about growth and development, and specifically different stages of your life. I'm dancing around it. We're talking about Piaget stages is what we're doing today. This is one of those topics that I feel like comes up often. It's not incredibly complex, but there are some like little details that you really need to get down. And this is something that it tends to show up a surprising amount on AAMC stuff. I feel like of all the different people to talk about different stages of development, Piaget is at the top of the list. And so for that reason, the MCAT likes to talk about it, which is why we want to talk about it today.
Yeah. And, I think that the theories of development in general come up a lot. And so it's one of those things where you've got to know them and you've got to know who is associated with each one, which is why, we don't try and go through every single one in one podcast. But I have a suspicion we might go over some others in the future just because they really are high yield. One of the things that I like about getting to chat about Piaget's stages is that you can actually correlate them pretty darn well with what you see in real life. And so it makes it easier to be able to remember them come test day as you're studying. And so the first stage that we're going to be talking about, first, let's contextualize it in terms of time frame. So those are going to be very, very young, 0 to 2 years old. So what we're going to do is we're going to tap into our mind and think of, okay, newborn infant, running around 2-year-old. And so we're going to start off with the sensory motor stage. The name tells us a whole lot about what's going on there. So really this child, right, is taking in, they're using their senses, taking in a ton of information. We know that they're not doing a whole lot in terms of actively processing that, but they're also learning to develop some motor skills. So you think about an infant, right? They, are looking around and they're curious, and you can kind of see that curiosity in their eyes. They might start reaching for things, putting things in their mouth. They'll eventually, right, start being able to grab some food, especially once you start introducing like those, grains or baby cereals, and start putting them in their mouth. And so it's really about, okay, what is coming in terms of sensory, and how are they responding to it at a pretty basic level.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, I do want to kind of take just a moment, just a quick step back and point out, when we talk about development of a human, this could be a lot of different aspects, like physical development and puberty and things like that. But Piaget is really just concerned with cognitive development. And so what's going on, and so the different stages, and you hit that's the perfect way of just saying sensory motor is babies are sensors and motors, and in terms of cognition, according to Piaget, they just see things and do things. They respond to stimuli. And so that's kind of the main thing going on there. They do also start to develop that object permanence thing as well, which is seems so obvious to us who are older than the age of 1, but is maybe not as obvious to a younger crowd.
It's Peekaboo.
Yeah.
It's just Peekaboo. And so if you think about, what you're, how you're playing with, a 6-month-old, a 1-year-old, eventually a 2-year-old, right? Well, I think one of our first natural responses to play with babies is to play Peekaboo. I am a fairly new aunt for the first time, and I am living this where, at first I wanted to play Peekaboo with my nephew, but he still wasn't developed enough to really, there's a time where Peekaboo doesn't really work. And then there's a time where all of a sudden Peekaboo is really fun and cute because they have they're recognizing, hands are covering something, right? It feels like it disappeared and then just, it's still there. Then that works because they don't have that sense of object permanence, right? That's something that develops and kind of marks, the, not the exact end, but ending of the sensory motor stage. And so it's something that it doesn't work quite as well over the phone and FaceTime. Unfortunately, especially because what we have now realized is that he can see himself in the little box on the top. So he ends up just staring at himself instead of playing with us on the phone. So I'm going to have to wait until the next time I see him in person and just play Peekaboo for half an hour and bask in the sensory motor stage.
Yeah, and that's something I feel like that's also like recognizing yourself in a mirror or reflection is a totally different cognitive like test for like awareness of yourself. But that's something Piaget never really talked about as far as I know. But just a quick like definition, because object permanence I think most people are familiar with, but like I said, like to a baby, it's not actually obvious that if you don't see something, it still exists, right? Like to a baby, like once you walk out of their eye line, they have no understanding of how the world works. And so you walk out of their eye line, essentially you cease to exist for that kid. And so object permanence is just starting to understand that even though you can't sense things, they're still there. Right. So objects are permanent, even if you can't be like actively taking in things. And so that's why the peekaboo thing is mind blowing to a little kid, because it's like, oh, I disappeared and I stopped existing. Oh, I'm back. And I'm just kind of like, ceased to exist there for a moment when I covered up my face with my hands. But like once you start to get past that second year, so you get into So the next three stages are all based on like operational, right? Like how operational is your cognition, right? Kind of like going through this. And so according to Piaget, this is still a stage where we're not like fully operational, cognitively speaking. And so he calls this stage pre-operational. So this is the sensory motor and then pre-operational stage, which is from like 2 to 7. There are a couple of things that the MCAT likes to ask about this, but I think for this stage, like some of the most important things are centration, which is just a lack of conservation. And like those are like really high yield vocab MCAT terms. But like conservation is an understanding that variables can impact each other and relationships. And so this usually gets tested with the idea of like, imagine you have like a liter of water and you pour 1 liter into a wide, short bowl and you pour 1 liter into like a tall, like thin vase, right? And you ask the kid, like, which one's bigger? Like, which one has more water in it? And they'll point to the one that's the tall vase because it's taller. And like, actually, it's the same amount of water in both. And like, it's weird because you can like pour the water from the vase into the bowl and show them that they're the same and then pour it back into the vase. And they're like, oh, the vase has more. Because they're so centered. They can only focus on one aspect. So that's where the centration comes in, where they can only think about height or only think about length or only think about width or only think about like just one aspect of something. They don't have this ability to understand conservation, that there are different variables between them. This is something that's like really funny to watch with like a kid when they're in these stages. Like you can take like a stack of quarters that is like, it's like, let's say it's 5 quarters and like there's 2 stacks. And then you take one stack and you spread them out into a long line. And you're like, which one has more quarters in the pile? And they're like, that one, because it's longer. And it's like that's 5 quarters and it's 5 quarters here. Like just because it's longer doesn't mean it's more quarters just because we spaced them out. But that's something that Piaget really focused on, was this fact that like people in that age, once again, 2 to 7, tend to get kind of centrated, or they don't understand conservation. And so centration and lack of conservation are common MCAT terms when it comes to the pre-operational stage.
Yeah, kids have this, like I think even just the word centration itself, if you just think about that first part, right, center, tells you what you need to know about this stage, because children are also in this stage are also egocentric and they are centered on the self, right? They are the center of their universe. Things revolve around them. And so egocentric is looking at things through a self-centered perspective. And so 2 to 7-year-olds, we're talking, preschool to second grade. One of their favorite words will be mine, right?
Mhm.
You don't have to teach a child to be selfish and to want things for themselves and not necessarily, want to share things like that. If you think about little kids, you often have to tell them, no, like go share, right?
Mhm.
Unless they're, actively seeing it modeled and things like that. But it's really this self-centered experience that they're having. And if we think about that, right, that kind of makes sense because up until now, that has been the case, right? If you think about the sensory motor stage, it was all about getting them fed and getting them cared for. And so it's, somewhat natural for it to continue to feel like they are the center, right? Something else that starts developing, which is really cool, and I think we can think about this again, just, I don't know about you, age is a little harder for me to kind of pinpoint, whereas I think of, if I think of like first grade, second grade, that for me just feels a little bit more intuitive. But around this time, they start using language more efficiently. And so if you think about, that sensory motor stage, they're just babbling maybe a few words. They might be able to put 2, sometimes 3 together. But by the time they turn, 2 and are moving up and, up to a second grader, their language is developing quite rapidly, right?
Yeah.
It's exponential at that point, and they can have, full-blown conversations with you. And one of the really interesting things is that they stop taking things quite so literally. It doesn't mean that some things will not go over their heads. But if you think about a second grader, right? We all know that sassy second grader, whether it's someone in your family, whether it's someone you went to school with, they're just like, ugh, you're killing me, right? When you do something they don't like. They don't mean like that you are literally, injuring them or killing them. It's this kind of symbolic term that they, symbolic phrase that they've perhaps heard other people use, right? Have seen. And so they get much better at this kind of symbolic thinking in language and application to language.
Yeah. This is also usually when kids like start to read too. And so that's where this like symbolism comes in and like realizing, oh, this series of squiggles is not a chair, but it means chair, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the symbol for chair. And so this ability to like understand like hyperbole and exaggeration is kind of a hallmark of like the things developing in this stage. And so the symbolism and language, they still have this centration though. And so like I know a lot of times people are like, oh, if they understand symbolism, like maybe they can do like algebra, right? Because they understand X could mean any number. And like if you get into a scenario where you have like maybe they could do like X plus 2 is equal to 7, and they're like, okay, well that's got to be 5. But if you start to do things like X plus 2 is equal to Y, and what are all the values and relationships, and like they tend to be so focused on just one variable, and they can't kind of handle that multivariable scenario. That's something like why teaching algebra to 5-year-olds is hard, or maybe even impossible, at least according to Piaget. But I do want to mention that egocentrism thing, because you're right, kids are just naturally egocentric. And that's why that like sharing thing is like they have a hard time being like, I want to play with the blocks, and so I should be able to play with the blocks, and like starting to realize like, no, there are other people and they have feelings, right? And that's why I feel like a lot of those shows and TV shows and stuff like that are designed for this age range, those shows are all about like, no, like if you do this, it'll hurt their feelings. And so we shouldn't do that. And like, because you're just trying to drive into those little kids, like, stop being so egocentric. Other people exist. And so that's why all the shows are about like sharing and understanding other people. And sometimes people's feelings get hurt and you should be nice and things like that, because a lot of that comes down to just this egocentrism. I want to be clear. Egocentrism still exists in older crowds,
yes.
But the idea here is that like the default for 2 to 7-year-olds is a very egocentric point of view, and like just this inability to understand other people's points of view.
Yeah, and I think what you just said there is really key, right? Because it's kind of this inability to put themselves in someone else's shoes. Adults that remain egocentric know that their actions have effects on other people, right? It's a little bit
Or should.
or should. Yes. And it's crazy. We're talking about the TV shows that like are out now and kind of emphasizing, sharing and other people have feelings. And I realized the other day I was on social media and it hit me just how much our shows, like the TV shows that we grew up watching, not just influence us, but stay with us. So it was, I don't know if you ever watched Arthur growing up. Okay. So they just started playing the theme song. And I realized I hadn't seen the show in years. And I still knew and could sing every single word of the entire theme song. And I think that's a testament to just like how, as little kids, our brains just soak things in. And it's such a, cognitively important and vulnerable time. And so, yeah, that's a good time to teach kids to share and not be selfish.
Yeah. So just to recap, because things get more complex the further we go. Sensory motors, like, we're sensors and motors, and it blows our minds that things still exist even when we can't see them, right? But the pre-operational stage, we have centration, we have lack of conservation, we have egocentrism, we have this symbolism and language kind of being developed, and all that's happening like 2 to 7. So obviously, as we move past that, we start to kind of lose that centration and develop conservation, right? So this is when like around 7 to 11 years old, this is when you actually can teach a kid multivariable algebra. Not that it's going to be easy, but like they're mentally capable. A 10-year-old can understand like X's and Y's, and like these are two variables, but they affect each other. And they're able to do that because they can start to understand like conservation, right? So if like, the volume has to be 1 liter, and so if the height goes up, the sides have to narrow, and like in order to keep that volume the same. And so they can start to understand how variables can interact with each other. And so that 10-year-old is not going to get fooled by saying like, I'm going to spread out these quarters and now I'm giving you more money, right? Like, no, they're like, wait a minute, that's still 5 quarters, right? Like spreading them out doesn't mean you're paying me more. You kind of run out of the ability to trick a kid with that once they hit that like around 7 years of age.
Just to, again, kind of for those that have a similar thought process as me in terms of grades. So, 7 kind of borders, I think usually like that's like 2nd, 3rd grade or so. So at this point, we're talking 3rd through like 6th grade. And so hopefully that makes it clear as to why like you can teach, a 5th or a 6th grader algebra. And that is part of the normal curriculum, right? I remember that in I don't remember if it was 5th or if it was 6th grade, somewhere actually around there, was when they started introducing like algebra formally as a class. And so that is something that now they can do. They're also able to kind of work through things logically. And so this should also make sense because now it's not just like reading, coloring books and picture books. They're sitting down, they're reading, longer novels and fiction, and they're able to draw conclusions themselves when given information. And so they kind of, it's going to sound weird to say, but they kind of start thinking for themselves, right? And so that capacity for logic becomes really important because you want kids who are in, 4th, 5th, 6th grades, 6th grade to be able to think logically, right? And something else that becomes, really important is how far does that logic extend, right? So if you, if you were to give a, 5th or 6th-year-old the trolley problem. So basically you have, you have a trolley, two different tracks it can go on. There's someone, if you, right now it's currently going to the left and you would, hurt this person, but you can pull the lever and hurt these other people. And so in either case, you're going to hurt somebody. And then, people have conversations about this problem all of the time. You try and sit down with a 5th grader to think about something that is kind of, that requires that much abstract thought and that much, and we're not going to go into morality because that's not Piaget's kind of focus, but that's not going to be as productive of a conversation at that time, right? Because they're not really, they wouldn't do well with highly abstract things. And so there is some level of logic that goes there, but the nuances and the complexities of that problem, which is something that adults still think about, are going to be lost on a, third, fourth, fifth grader.
Yeah. It comes down to a lot of like hypotheticals. Like they kind of start to struggle with like, imagine a scenario where if this was the case or that was the case, like what's the right thing to do? And like, not to go too far into morality, but that's something that is a little bit difficult, right? Like this abstract, concrete stuff. You talk to an 8-year-old, they know that smoking is bad and they know that murder is bad, but in their minds, they're kind of the same because they're both bad. And so, like, somebody smokes, that's pretty much the same as if somebody was a murderer, in terms of like levels of badness, right? Because they have trouble with that kind of abstraction. I like that you mentioned kind of reading, right? Because like in first grade, a lot of the stories that you're reading are not like putting yourself in the shoes of somebody, like, for example, going to wizarding school or something like that, right? And so once we get into this stage of like 7 to 11 years old, all of a sudden you're like that egocentrism kind of goes away and you can imagine yourself in someone else's shoes. And so the books get a little bit more interesting in terms of like, oh, this character going through this thing, and that actually resonates a lot more with a 10-year-old than it does with a 6-year-old. And so we start to have this ability to kind of go a little bit farther. But you're right, we still kind of lack that super abstract thought. Like it's hard to have an in-depth discussion of ethics with a 9-year-old. Or like the books, while they do allow you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else, they're not like passages on like, oh, the effect of theocracy on economies and like how those things can like start to become interwoven and like that's just impossible to grasp for somebody in this stage. To be honest, like that kind of seems difficult to grasp, even if you're older. But like the idea here is at this stage, you're just mentally incapable of doing that level of stuff because your brain is still developing.
Yeah, I really want to pause this super quick and remind our listeners, viewers, that this is Piaget's understanding of people, right? This does not mean that every single, sixth grader is incapable of, having at least some capacity for hypotheticals, right? We know that people develop at very different speeds. We know that, even in pediatrics, when you're thinking about child development, right, there's some wiggle room because we recognize that everyone develops differently. But this is just the framework that Piaget used. And this framework is what you're going to get tested. So I just really wanted to put that out there so no one thinks that we're saying that, you can only start thinking logically at this grade, or you can only,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that is a good thing to keep in mind because there's lots of other people who have different views on these things. Yeah. But like we said, Piaget gets tested all the time. And so that stage was the concrete operation. Like we can deal with, you can think about it as like, concrete is a physical thing. So you can deal with like simple physical, but not super abstract things. That's always how I think of like, a ball of concrete. That's a physical thing. That's not super abstract. And so in this stage, we're not dealing with like abstract stuff. We're dealing with things that are concrete. And so this takes us into the last stage, according to Piaget, which is the formal operational stage. And so according to Piaget, like after 11, this is when things kind of go like beyond, and this is kind of like the last final cognitive push. And so at this point, we start to get that ability to have that more logical and abstract thought. We start to be able to do hypotheticals, right? You can form hypotheses and test these things. This is when people become scientists, according to Piaget. And so like asking that scenario of like the trolley problem of being like, hey, like this trolley is headed for down this track and it's going to hit 5 people, or you can pull this lever and it's going to hit 1 person instead. But that person wasn't going to get hit unless you pull that lever. Like, should you pull the lever and try to figure that out? And to be honest, like the trolley problem is like that's a big philosophical problem that's got tons of variations, right? And like it's a interesting way to look at ethics. But like this just becomes something that is more like you can just do more once you get to this stage. You can get abstract. And so all of a sudden the books get a little bit more interesting as well, where all of a sudden we're dealing with abstract stuff, right? Where you're dealing with like, oh, in this book, there's a problem caused by the effects of capitalism or caused by the effects of socialism or things like that. Maybe those terms aren't mentioned specifically, but you can start to kind of understand like these weird ideas and how they can kind of affect overall. And so there starts to be like some abstract subtext that you can start to mix in, and like the nature of autonomy, and should people be completely in charge of their life, even if they're going to make poor decisions. And like that can become something that is a theme for a book that might show up in someone who's a little bit older. And so we start to kind of have these shifts as we go through, where things get more complicated, more advanced, just as we move up through the stages.
Yeah, these are middle schoolers, high schoolers beyond. And so you can, think about, they start also, we encourage people to start planning at this stage, right? Like just thinking about this, the word planning was not something that, Piaget necessarily was talking about, but in his conversation about them being able to think about the future, that's the correlate here. We start asking, if you ask a middle schooler, oh, what do you want to do when you grow up? You ask a high schooler, what do you want to do when you grow up? Right? They have the capacity to form more specific, more targeted ideas and goals, right? Whereas if you ask a second grader, what do you want to be when you grow up? You're probably going to get something like, I want to be an astronaut and a doctor and,
a fire truck.
3 other things. Huh?
And a fire truck.
And a fire truck.
That's what I wanted to be when I was a kid. I want to be a fire truck.
Really? What was, out of curiosity, why a fire truck?
They were cool. Like, I'm just like, my mom tells me about that often, because it's like you didn't even want to be a human. You wanted to be a truck. And I'm like, yep, that makes sense.
I was one of those weird kids that knew they wanted to be a doctor that young.
Mm-hmm.
My parents probably should not have let me watch my life in the ER growing up, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you get older, naturally, you're able to start thinking about the future. You're able to start kind of planning. And that's something else that starts coming in during this stage. For Piaget, just being able to think about these hypotheticals and the future falling under that category of hypotheticals, right?
Yeah. And knowing how to take steps. Because like a kid will say like, oh, I want to be a doctor. And like a high schooler say, I want to be a doctor. But the high schooler can go about, so I need to do this and this, and I need to focus on this. And like, this is not as important, but it's something I enjoy doing. So I'd like to keep doing that. Yeah. And like, all of a sudden they can kind of like see like paths and kind of how these things branch. And that's where the hypothetical stuff goes in. One thing that I know is always trouble with these stages is remembering the actual age ranges. So this is a silly thing that a student taught me once, but it stuck with me. And so now I like to use it because there's a chance it might stick with other students. But I would just remember that Piaget is going to 7-Eleven. And so it's the stages or the gaps between those is 2, 7, and 11. So up to 2, 2 to 7, 7 to 11, and then 11 past that. And so he's going to 7-Eleven.
That's
and then
really
you can just
cute.
break
I
up
like
the stages. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to give a quick recap because we've talked about quite a bit. So I want to use that. So he is going to 2. So that going to 2, 0 to 2, that's that sensory motor stage. As you very nicely put it, babies and small children are sensors and motors.
Yeah.
They take in their sensation, they produce some movement, and that's part of what makes Peekaboo fun, because they are able to giggle, to laugh when they don't have the object permanence, to realize that you're just hiding behind your own hands rather than disappearing off to another room. I just thought about this. It's like, have you seen those videos where people will like hold up a blanket and then shoot to the other side?
Yeah.
And it's funny because dogs will like freak out, right?
Yeah.
So now that's an association in my mind too. So that's sensory motor. Then pre-operational is going to 7. And that's going to be your elementary students, basically. They're really focused on themselves. They don't really realize that, a stack of quarters is the same if you just flatten it and put it across the table. You can get away with some questionable things with that.
Yeah.
And they're developing a better understanding of language, right? They're understanding some symbolism. They can't put a whole lot of different things together at that point. So then we have the concrete operational stage, things like you said that I hadn't thought about as a ball of concrete, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
Because no matter where it goes, that ball of concrete is there. That's going to be conservation. You can start teaching them some algebra, and they're able to start making connections, but you're not going to give them the trolley problem. Now that they're in high school, 7-11, that formal operational, toss the trolley problem at them. Let's see what they think about it. And they're able to have that more abstract thinking, and kind of think about hypotheticals, the future plans, and really be able to have some kind of hypothesis and be able to actually test it, right? And to take steps towards it.
Yeah. So just to, I like that recap, but I just want to kind of point out Piaget, as we mentioned, shows up all the time. There are other stages of development, like Erikson and Freud and Kohlberg all have different stages, but I think Piaget might be just the highest yield one. And so definitely want to take some time to kind of go through those. So hopefully that puts everything in context. And at the very least might give you something interesting to do with little kids if you're ever around little kids, is start to test them on conservation, or see if they're centrated. But yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up the topic. I do want to also throw a quick recap out there, or a quick reminder. So next week's episode is our 2-year anniversary, and of the first episode that we put out. And so super excited with that one. Maybe, is it next week or is it the week after?
I think it's the week after.
It might be the week after. Yeah.
We're so excited.
Yeah, we're so excited. I'm jumping the gun.
It closer.
But if you guys want to submit any questions to us, please email us at podcast@jackwestin.com. We love getting questions from students, and we'll probably do another special episode where we just answer questions from students.
And also, we have been getting some requests for topics as well. And we really appreciate that. You guys have some really great suggestions and requests. So if you have questions for us to answer, just kind of general, or ask us anything, AMA 2-year podcast anniversary, that one will be answered. Those questions will be answered there. So you still have a bit of time to send in questions for that. So please send them in. And then for the topics, continue to just send those to us, and we'll try and, get those topics in the podcast, show you what's high yield. Because at the end of the day, like we said in our 100th podcast episode, we really do this for you guys, right? You guys are the Jack Westin podcast, and we want you guys to get as much as you can out of it.